If you bought my book and you're reading this and you don't like what you see and you want your money back, I'm happy to oblige. I've been in the same situation more than a few times in my life, I can tell you that. All it took was a few bad poems, and I wanted out. I wanted my hard earned money back, or at least a trade option for something more lyrically compelling. I want you to feel free to do the same, although it's not like I have a portfolio of alternative metaphors that I can substitute on a moment's notice for the ones you find troubling, although perhaps I should. Nothing like the well roped star of barbarians to keep your interest. Stay with me. You worked so hard to get here. No point in leaving now.
Hey, Bruce, can you pull your laptop down a little bit just so we can see your face better? Okay, perfect.
How's that?
That looks great.
Okay. This is called My Corona Landslide. I think every poet that I know wrote a response to the pandemic. Some of them brilliant, I think. This is uh, my attempt. I'm inside of a mine where the river's been blown out, wall of blood cascading just behind me, so I run fast, even after everything that's happened. I stay ahead of the wall of blood. I stay ahead. I know not to ask questions about the origin of pain or about the screams that tear the flawless sky to shreds right before our eyes. I know that much. A thing that hunts us all keeps us apart and wants to kill as many as it can. You'll walk along the lake tonight without my hand around your hand, your voice inside my heart. You'll walk alone, for this is how it is. And I won't pray for any God to save us from ourselves, but I will hold the whole of you inside of me. The blood, a darkened purple wave, not here, not far away. I'll be happy to answer questions, but I don't really say that much about these poems when I read them because my true desire is that they work without me saying anything, and then if they don't, well, that's my problem. This is called The Dangers of Searching the Photographs of Reynaldo Sandoval. I thought about death, watching her sleep that day, although I knew it wasn't sleep that the dead practice, but something like sleep. A rock bridge collapses to make a chasm too wide to cross safely. A man is holding another man's head by reaching into the bars of a cage hung from the ornate ceiling by a chain. Somewhere, the sky at dusk is filled with birds. Somewhere, a woman's face is gullied by the rivers of her years, her beauty finding refuge in her dark eyes. If we were generous by nature, there would be enough for everyone, but we're not. And whose fucking plan was that, I wonder? I saw an elephant carved into the sheer face of a cliff by ancient hands, and I could only weep. Deserts stretched out before me, my only tender escape. Kissing, the man and the woman melt into each other's faces. There were some words of Lorca, some cities drowned in their own light. The poet William Stafford has written some brilliant poems that I would call neighborhood poems, poems about just kind of ordinary stuff that goes on in suburban neighborhoods. And so or urban neighborhoods. So I tried to do the same thing with this poem. It's called "The New Road Neighborhood Showdown." The B flat sound of heavy equipment backing up between orange barrels, loud metal slammed into metal. Some longtime neighbors gather along the curb, grumbling to watch the new road go in. And although I stand nearby, their gossip is a code that I can't break. And I don't know why I'm always on the verge, looking in as if through the windows of a house where I'm no longer welcome, all the family gathered happily at the long table. Heavy rollers filled with water finish the job. They shape a seamless black ribbon driving back and forth, and then they're gone. The trucks move far enough away so the backup warning horn is faint through morning air, a tugboat calling through the eerie fog. I like a life like this. A little wonder everywhere you look. The great possibilities open like an unlit doorway. The new road finished all the way to hell. Okay, and I'll read one more short poem. This is called Night Message from a Friend. I was cold because I had carried the warmth of your life in my body. You left me here. But the sky was not so vast I had to close my eyes, and the defeat not so accurate so as to leave me with nothing. The night scarred face is something. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Right. Well, what a pleasure to hear those poems spoken in your voice. I don't get to see your face enough, and we get to write back and forth, but it's really a treat to hear you read these poems. And I'm so pleased that BOA just published this book, Apostle of Desire, which is, I should also note, this is Bruce's fourth book with BOA, including this one, which we're going to talk about a little bit, which was the first one, a translation that he did of Vietnamese poet and memoirist and novelist and just all around one of my favorite people in the world, Quay Mai. So, so I have a few questions I'd love to ask you, and I appreciate actually that you didn't give a ton of introduction to the poems because it gives me space to ask things and we can have a little chat. But my first question is about the title. You know, I always look at book titles as the first interaction that a reader has with any collection. So I'm curious what you would like or what you think Apostle of Desire communicates to potential readers.
I think I was trying to find a metaphor for that place where good and bad are very close together, where the sacred and profane are side by side. So if you think of it as a continuum, on one end you have the very worst, on the other hand, and you have the very best. But as you move toward the middle, it gets more and more ambiguous until there's this space where it's kind of difficult to tell which one it is. And that was the space, that was the sensibility that I was interested in.
So you have, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you practice Buddhism. Is that correct?
I do, yes.
Yeah. So I mean, I can't help but think of the title in terms of that too. And you have those two things. You have the apostle, which is a Christian term more than anything, right? But
Yes.
desire has a very complicated sort of relationship in Buddhism, or I should say Buddhism has a complicated relationship with desire. Not all negative, right?
No, that's right.
So maybe we could talk a little bit about how, I'd love to talk a little bit about your practice in general, your spirituality, your Buddhism in general, but specifically maybe with that, even this title, Does it come into play when you think about those terms put together?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, especially, the desire part, as you mentioned. Desire is a big word in the Dharma. It's complicated. It's not clear cut, uh, but to understand it or try to understand it, you can learn a great deal about yourself and about the world around you. So, um, I just like that. I'm really attracted to that in between place, and you know it, it reminds me, in terms of my practice, it reminds me of what my teachers have tried to teach me about empty. That it's like that. It's in the presence of everything, you see nothing. As soon as you understand the truth, you know nothing. Those ideas. So I think that's all part of it's all part of that collection, but also what I was thinking about in the title.
Yeah.
I went back and forth with titles, as you know. I had 3 or 4 different titles, and I agree with you about the title being, important because it's the first engagement with the book. So I thought about it a long time. I tried it out on a lot of people before I settled on it.
Yeah. And how have your teachers and how has Buddhism impacted your poetry? And I guess maybe how long have you been practicing? Because we can weigh that against your own,
Yeah,
writing too.
I guess about 25 years. Um, I purposely avoided for a long, long time, most of those 25 years, writing anything explicitly about my practice or about my thinking on the Dharma. I just I didn't like the idea of doing that, and I love Buddhist poetry, and I've translated Vietnamese Buddhist poetry, but it wasn't for me. Uh, but what happens when you practice, when you sit, and when you meditate on a regular basis, is it becomes part of your life. So if you're a writer, it becomes part of that too. You're thinking about the poem changes because you're thinking about it from the perspective of a different perspective, a different kind of knowledge, and it doesn't make it any easier, but it provides, I think, enormous, maybe unending resources for writers to think in those terms, to think in the paradoxes of Buddhism. Almost every lesson I've ever learned, important lesson I've ever learned from my teachers, have been really complicated paradoxes that took me a long, long time to figure out. So, if you think about it, that's not too unlike the practice of poetry.
Mhm. That
Trying
was
to
my
solve,
thought as you were saying that. Yeah.
yeah, trying to solve those same problems.
Yeah. And even the concept of maybe the poet, being a poet, which I know as a young person in love with language, the idea of becoming a poet, becoming a writer is such a burning passion, I think. And it comes through in your work. And there's got to be a certain moment too of that practice when this concept of identity as a poet starts to come into play too. And what does that even mean? And I guess
Yeah,
there's the desire there. We're back to desire again, I suppose, right? The desire
yeah,
to be a poet and to be read. And
yeah. It's a mixed blessing, as James Wright said. Uh, I think that the to think of yourself as a poet is one thing, and to be a poet is something else. And uh, I've had editors and agents complain that I don't do enough of the former. Um, and I understand that, and I understand also if someone believes that it's the writer's responsibility to do that. Money is involved. People are putting money in to support what you're doing, so I understand that. But it's just not, it's never been for me. That's all.
yeah.
I think about it in a different way.
There's I know you do a lot of work with veterans, being a veteran yourself, a Vietnam veteran yourself, and I know you do a lot of ongoing work with veterans as well. And that makes its way into your work and certainly into this book as well. I'm thinking specifically of the quality of mental health care at the VA,
Yeah,
but you know, it's woven throughout.
yeah.
So, could you talk some about how those experiences as a veteran yourself, but also working with veterans in an ongoing way, has impacted your writing and then your writing in this book?
Yeah, it's to spend time with veterans is a way, whether you like it or not, whether I like it or not, is a way to cultivate memories. Not all of them good memories. Um, when veterans are around other veterans is the time when they talk about their combat experiences. Um, and for a while as a writer, I tried to resist my instinct to write about those experiences. First of all, because as an undergraduate, I was discouraged by a teacher from doing it. And then secondly, once I ignored him and did it anyway and started publishing, I started worrying about the fact that I was, as an artist, I was trading on other people's suffering. And I decided to shift away from that subject. But then a funny thing happened. I started going back to Vietnam, so that I could now write poems about Vietnam that had nothing to do with my experience in the war or the American experience in the war even, but about Vietnam itself and about the people and the place and the beauty and the culture. So being able to do that, broadened the diction that I suddenly found appropriate for poetry. And it gave me this whole other world of literary resources. And then, trying to learn the language and working with Vietnamese to translate Vietnamese poetry has taught me more about my own language than anything else I've ever done. So I do it for selfish reasons.
Could you expand on that a little bit more? And I guess I'm thinking, what do you find in Vietnamese poetry that maybe we don't find as much in American poetry?
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's a good question. Of course, Vietnamese poetry has changed over time, just like our poetry has changed over time. There are certain forms that remain consistent through time, just like certain English forms are still around today. Um, so I have my favorite periods, and my favorite period in general is the war period. Um, the, those poets, soldiers, are among my favorite Vietnamese poets. And there are many young contemporary Vietnamese poets that I admire a great deal. But that work is so deeply abiding in terms of its commitment to make us see what war was. The non-combatant, to understand the suffering, not through these sort of first-person self-indulgent narratives, but just through describing with beautiful precision the things that went around, that were going around them when they were out there doing what they were doing, against impossible odds with little resources, and stopping in the evening to write poems in their journals, some of which I've translated. I published a little book years ago called Poems from Captured Documents. And one of the things that soldiers in the field was trained to do whenever there was a captured or a wounded or a dead enemy soldier was to remove all paperwork from them and give it to the intelligence officer, and they would send it somewhere, and it would be put on microfilm and studied for military significance. Well, I went and visited an archive 30 years later after the fact at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, where some of this material, where this microfiche was, a copy of it was kept. And I saw several poems. And with a Vietnamese, young Vietnamese woman named Nguyen Thanh, we translated about 25 of them and published them at UMass Press. But, just American soldiers had Playboy. They were the Vietnamese. Our enemy was writing beautiful poems. We never had a chance.
And along the way, you discovered Quay Mai's poetry. And if you wouldn't mind, maybe sharing a little bit about the story of finding her work, what her work means to you, and the translating of that work as well. And for those who don't know, I mentioned that we published a book, The Secret of Hosen, that is her translated poetry, but she's also written some beautiful memoir and fiction about her experience growing up.
Yeah.
So could you talk a little bit about her?
Yeah, I'm going to get her book real quick. Excuse me.
Okay, yeah.
So I'm trying to remember the first time I met Quay Mai. It was at a writers' retreat in Vietnam, and it's really funny when there are such retreats in Vietnam. They happen at what the Vietnamese call, I'll use the English word, called resort. It's resort. So at least that's how I translated the word. Maybe it was my problem. And then when you get there, it's not quite what you think a resort is. It's kind of rough camping. So I went to this retreat. There were readings and discussions about poetry and about translation. And I heard Quay Mai read her poems in Vietnamese. And my Vietnamese wasn't very good, but the poems are really direct and accessible in Vietnamese and in English too, I think. So I was drawn to them right away. And then we talked, and her English, of course, was accomplished. So we spent a lot of time talking, getting to know each other, and we became good friends, good writer friends, sharing work back and forth and translating each other's work, which helps both ways to do that. And now she has a new book of poetry just out, but she's primarily become a fiction writer. And she's published 2 novels and a memoir. And I think that's the direction that she wants to take. But I hope she doesn't give up on poetry, because I think she's a magical poet. And I love especially the version of Vietnam that she gives us, which is kind of she had experience growing up in the North and in the South. So she has intimate access to both those consciousness, and that informs the poems in really rich and unusual ways, really. So I think that's what I admire most about The Secret of Hua-Sen.
In what years was she growing up too? I'm thinking of your earlier comments about the era of poetry that you particularly admire.
Yeah. Well, that work would have had a huge influence on her work.
Yeah.
That would have been the work. That would have been the work that she studied in school.
Okay.
Yeah, and probably that her friends and neighbors read. You understand that poetry is much more widely read in Vietnam than it is in our country. I when I'm in Vietnam, whenever I meet a new person and I get to know them a little bit, the first thing I ask them is if they can tell me a poem. And I've never met anyone who couldn't tell me a poem.
Wow.
So it's really fun to be a writer there.
Yeah. Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's not what happens in the grocery store here usually.
No, you get arrested if you do that here.
It's very suspect. Yeah. It's very well. I will say one of my favorite experiences at BOA all this time was I did an interview, and I have to find it because I believe we filmed it too, with both of you together sitting in the BOA office.
I
And
remember that.
yeah, it was wonderful because it was almost like you were doing the translation, the translator poet relationship back and forth out loud, lived aloud, and you would tell a story and then she would sort of revise and correct it and then you would sort of build on that. And it was, I remember thinking like I'm watching this process, play out in real time, and the dynamic, the ease of going back and forth and truly revising in real time, what was
That's
being
right.
said at that
Yeah.
moment was really beautiful. And I believe she had some, now I'm remembering, she had some words, or maybe you had words in Vietnamese, and then you were flipping them over and saying what the translated word is. Gosh, we got to find that video. It was really beautiful.
She was a joy to work with, and the way that we worked, and she helped train me, is the way that I work now on translations, which is now the author that I work with is proficient in English, so he does a translation of his own, and then I do a translation without seeing his, and then we compare them. And then the process of putting the finished product together is deciding who's right. And sometimes it means elements of both versions. Sometimes our versions are very much alike. Sometimes they seem like they're entirely different poems. And, that's because of the contextual nature of Vietnamese. Meaning depends upon context. And that's something that's inherent in the consciousness of Vietnamese poets. So it's nothing that they really have to think about. It's just there, but we have to think about it. So it's a little bit difficult. But yeah, I learned a lot from her, and she's a terrific person.
Yeah, I'm curious. I know that your work has been translated quite a bit into Vietnamese as well. And I guess I wonder about, is there an openness to hearing, being a soldier who fought for the United States in what we call the Vietnam War, which is not what Vietnamese called the Vietnam War, right? But they would call, what is the term for the Vietnam War in Vietnam? In
The American.
Vietnamese? The American War. So being a soldier who fought in the American War, was there an openness to hearing your poetry? Was there any sort of resistance to it? What is the reception of that in general?
Yeah, not only openness, but open arms, welcoming openness,
Mm-hmm.
and invitation into their literary community. And I'll just say that the end of last year, the president of Vietnam came to New York to speak at the UN, and I was told just a few days in advance of his visit that I needed to go to New York because I was being given a medal by the president, and it's the highest civilian medal that Vietnam gives. And there were four of us who got the medal. The three other people were anti-war people from the 60s and 70s, and myself. And so I got to meet the president, shake his hand, said hello, and got my medal and my certificate, which it means a lot to them. And it means a lot to them because they understand that to do what I've done has taken a certain amount of devotion to understanding their culture and their language. So it's very gratifying. I love being there, and like I say, it's a great place to be a writer. I highly encourage any writer who has a few extra bucks to take a trip to Hanoi and hang out for 10 days, and you'll have the time of your life.
And you spend a good chunk of every year living in Vietnam. I think you just said you're going for 6 months too. So
Yeah.
we're not talking about just sort of studying a language and learning it and that's that. And now I'm going to do a translation. This is lived experience.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes a big difference because, like I said, because of the contextual nature of the language and of the literary environment. That Hanoi is one of those great walking cities and outdoor cafe cities with tens of thousands of coffee shops, some of them right next to each other, but still full of people. It's that kind of culture. So to be able to spend time like that on the street with the people is to afford an opportunity to have insights when you're doing the translations as well. You learn things, you learn subtle things. I'll try to give you an example. Here's a good example. If you go to a coffee shop, this is what I learned. My friend told me to watch someone as they were drinking their coffee. So I watched these two people who ordered coffee. I already had mine, and I waited and waited, and they talked, and they looked at their phones, and they shared their phones with each other, and they talked some more, and they read the newspaper, and then after what seemed like a really long time, they took a tiny sip of their coffee, and then they put their cups back down and went through the same routine that they started with. And this went on for 45 minutes. And he told me, he said, if you finish in an hour, then you're drinking too fast. So, when you run into that cultural reference in a poem, it means a lot. It's loaded, and everyone knows it. Geographical references work the same way. There's a mountain range that divides Vietnam in half, north and south. It's called Chung Sung Mountains. And it's full of history for obvious reasons because it's a natural barrier, a natural wall. So whenever you use that in a poem, that whole rich history is brought into the poem. The Vietnamese reader knows that, but the American reader doesn't. American reader just sees Chung Sung. So you have to figure out how to get around things like that. But doing that kind of work is great for your own poetry. So I've never minded doing it and always enjoyed it.
I'm still thinking about the coffee shop reference, and I'm wondering, like, to communicate that experience, right? That relationship that those two people are having, would it be enough to say drinking coffee, or would it be drinking coffee in a coffee shop? Would it be, you know what I mean? What would be the best way to sort of communicate that communion?
I think one thing I would be sure to try to do is talk about what the quality of light was. And what the background sounds were, because it's a real cacophony there. It's really rich.
Yeah.
I wonder, Bruce, if you can take a question from the audience here.
Absolutely.
We have Sheila who asked, were you practicing poetry before being in the war? How did the war impact your understanding or your approach to your work as a poet? So before and after.
No, I spent all of my free time up to when I was 18 years old playing sports and hanging out. And I didn't read books. My father was a working class man. My mother was a working class woman. They didn't read books. It wasn't a house of books. So, but my experience in the war opened my eyes in certain ways that allowed me more closely to see the importance of reading. So I started reading, and then I went crazy, and I never sat down without a book open in my lap, and I did that for 20 years. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Thanks,
Oh,
Bruce.
did
Thanks.
not hear.
So among your books of poetry, and this is, I want to say, your 20th published book, and I may be off by one or two, but we're around that territory.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
And it hasn't all been poetry. You've also written fiction. You had a really acclaimed memoir called Circle of Han that came out about your experiences during and then after the war. Are you still writing in multiple genres? And if so, at what point do you decide what genre you're going to be working in?
Well, I once I retired from teaching, I really fell in love with writing, and I really enjoy having a workman-like schedule. It's not unusual for me to write 8 hours a day, because I don't do anything else besides be a family member. I don't have a job. I teach an online workshop once a week for a couple hours, but that's it. So I have plenty of time. So 4 years ago, I began writing fiction. And I had this ridiculously naive idea that if I wrote fiction, I could make some money to help pay for my grandchildren's college education. And they were still young, still infants and children. But I knew I had to get on it. So I was fortunate to have an agent in New York, a really high level agent named Ellen Levine, who sold a couple of my books, my memoir and my new and selected poems. And I think she read 4 of my 8 novel manuscripts. And although she liked a few of them, and often complimented me on the writing, she also didn't see any commercial value in them. So she wouldn't take them on. So I kept writing them and kept trying. And like I say, I wrote 8 novels. And she eventually, well, let's just say we parted ways amicably. So as soon as we did that, I sat down and I started another novel. And I'm just finishing it right now. And I think it's the one that she would have liked out of all those others. So I'm in a bind because I no longer have an agent, and I have this novel. And it's so difficult to get an agent, a good agent. It's harder than being published. I'm telling you. So that's where I am. I am still running poetry. I have 2 finished manuscripts of poetry. Not having to teach and not having to do anything else for a living gives us so much time as writers that we're not used to, that suddenly we figure out, you know what, I can do this all day, and it's still there. It keeps coming out. So I enjoy my time here a lot.
Yeah, well, I'm really glad it keeps coming out, and I'm really glad that BOA was able to publish another collection of yours, Apostle of Desire. And I appreciate you being here tonight too, and just sharing all your stories with us and poems. And if you wouldn't mind leaving us with one more poem, I'd certainly appreciate that. Thank you, Bruce.
I'd be happy to. Thank you, and thanks for having me. It's been great, and great to see you. I hope we can get together one day before too long. This is a poem that I wrote for my teacher, Charles Simic, who died last year, 2 years ago. It's called An Ars Poetica. Although the answer isn't always rain, I come back to that again. The sound like pity through the empty trees, a vast gray sky that opens to the coming dark. What is this longing to know even the pain that must abide in us all, and to see into things deep enough to feel, I don't know, but only the emptiness lasts forever. And the rain continues to fall like vaguely made promises through the not yet frozen branches. See, not everything means something in that ordinary way, and what's measured and accounted for is often lost before we even see its brilliance. This is the nature of poetry and death. how every end of line is like a precipice you must discover in the dark to make your way, the last distinguished thing. Thank you. Goodbye.